Please be seated. The Lord appointed 70 others and sent them on ahead of him in pairs to every town and place where he himself intended to go. This week, a couple days ago, the Harvard Business Review published an article titled "The 6 Causes of Burnout and How to Avoid Them." And among the causes were sort of obvious ones like too much work, a lack of autonomy to do all that work, a lack of appropriate reward for all that work, or what they call a lack of fairness on the job. But there were also a couple other surprise factors, at least they were surprises to me, the article talked about. One was community. Because burnout, the article said, can be contagious. So if you're in a community where everyone is sort of burned out, that can lower your own morale. And finally, they also offered up the factor of a values mismatch. That if you value something really highly that your company does not value, then your motivation to work hard and your perseverance can drop significantly. And this article from a couple days ago is part of a recent trend. Back in May, the World Health Organization actually initially classified burnout as a medical disease, and then the next day they quickly clarified we didn't mean disease, but it is definitely something more than just in your mind. They called it an occupational phenomenon. They said it was a syndrome. And it's some kind of medical condition that they are now going to further study. And just this past January, the writer Anna Peterson published a long-form article that went viral on BuzzFeed, and it was titled "How Millennials Became the Burnout Generation." Now, if you're anything like me, the words BuzzFeed and then millennial sort of make you want to roll your eyes. But this article is worth reading, really, because she shows us that at its root, burnout is not about being lazy, and it's not because this present generation is not as resilient or tough as generations in the past. Rather, she says burnout is sort of a spiritual problem. Quote, "The exhaustion experienced in burnout combines an intense yearning for a state of completion with a tormenting sense that it cannot be attained. And that's one of the most frustrating expressions of burnout. It takes things that should be enjoyable and flattens them into a list of tasks, intermingled with other obligations that can either be easily or dutifully completed. And so the end result is that everything, from wedding celebrations to registering to vote, becomes tinged with anxiety, resentment, and avoidance." And so since burnout might be a spiritual problem, does the church have anything to say to this malady? Can we offer a source of hope or renewal? And if so, where is it and where can we find it? Now, one of the classic examples of burnout is Moses when he is in the desert with the Israelites on their way to Egypt. And if you don't know this story, it's a good one. So you probably, even if you don't know the Bible, are familiar. You know, Moses goes through the Red Sea. He takes the people into the desert. They're on their way to the Promised Land. They first stop at Mount Sinai. And at Mount Sinai, we get the 10 Commandments, and we get a whole bunch of other commandments. And they're there for about a year. But after about a year, they're ready to move on to the Promised Land. And think about all that these poor people have been through. And now they're just weeks away from finally completing their journey. And so the journey begins, they're heading toward the Promised Land, and what happens? The people, well, they start complaining. And they say to Moses, "Moses, we're hungry, we want some meat to eat. And back in Egypt, we used to eat fish, and it was free, and we had cucumbers and melons and leeks and onions and garlic, and now all you've given us to eat is this manna. We're sick of manna. We want some meat to eat. Please, Moses." And at this point, Moses, really, I think we can understand why. After he's taken the poor people from Egypt out of slavery into the desert, he just loses it. And he tells God, okay, God, I cannot take this complaining anymore. And he literally tells God, just kill me now. Please, just kill me now. Because the Israelite community, this community of just complaining people, has brought him burnout. There's a values mismatch. He highly values the promised land. They value security and having some meat for lunch. There's too much work, not much reward. Of course, he is burned out. And so God provides a very interesting solution. He says to Moses, all right, I hear what you're saying. So I want you now to take 70 of your elders, take them into the tabernacle around the tent of meeting, bring them there, and then I will take a share of your spirit and put it on all 70 of them, and they will help you do the work. And so that is the background to the story of the 70 that we hear in Luke's gospel today. And so why does Jesus empower a group of 70? I mean, we're familiar with the 12 disciples, but what is this group of 70? And while it's maybe a little too much to say that they're suffering from burnout like Moses, something about the 12 disciples here at this part of Luke's story, it shows that they're not quite operating at full capacity. To review, the 12 disciples are chosen a few chapters before in Luke 6. But by Luke 9, they seem to have kind of run out of gas. They can't do any more miracles. A man comes to them, to Jesus, and says, I asked your disciples to please heal my son, and they couldn't do anything. And then the disciples begin to argue among themselves, who among us, Jesus, is the greatest? And they show a real lack of understanding. The Samaritans last week, remember, don't receive Jesus. And what does the disciples say they want to do? They want to blow them up. Do you want us, Lord, to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them? So somehow in this story, up until this moment, the 12 disciples whom Jesus has called and empowered, they seem to be suffering from a little bit of burnout. And so after this, Jesus empowers the second group, the 70, whom we hear about in today's gospel. And unlike the 12, they seem to have some power. They're moving with some lightness. They're doing the work. Jesus praises them. They return with joy, and they say, Lord, even in your name, Satan falls down. And Jesus says, I see Satan fall down from heaven like a flash of lightning. And so in these two stories of Moses with the 70 and the 12 disciples with their 70, we begin to see a possible answer to this question. Does the church have anything to say about this epidemic of burnout? And it appears that one answer to burnout is community. Somehow, especially of those on the outside. For Moses' burdens are lifted when not just his brother and the Levites, but this group of 70 elders are empowered and given his spirit. And Jesus' burdens are lifted, and the burdens of the 12 apostles who seem to be suffering from some burnout, they are lifted when this group of 70 people who we don't really hear about outside of Luke's gospel, when they are empowered also to go and do the work. So the circle is expanding. And so here we see a profound lesson in our own lives, but also in the life of the church. The church, which is now suffering from a decades-long burnout. That in order to go forward, we must expand the circle, find our own 70, empower them to help us do the work. But there is a deeper lesson here. Because when you decide to share your burden with a community, to expand the circle who have responsibility, when you find your 70 and share your spirit with them, what you are really doing is what Paul said in his letter to the Galatians that we heard today. What you are doing is you are saying, may I never boast of anything except for the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ, by which the world has been crucified to me, and I to the world. And we do this because we are finally admitting that we need to take ourselves out of the middle of the picture, because we cannot do it alone. We are crucifying our ego to the world and admitting we need the help not only of other people, not only of the 70, but of the one who is now and forever. Listen to how Peterson ends that BuzzFeed article. She says, as I finish this piece, I feel something I haven't felt in a long time. I feel catharsis. I feel great. I feel something which is not the something I felt upon the completion of a task, because there are still things to do after this. But for the first time, I am seeing myself and the parameters of my labor and the causes of my burnout clearly. And it doesn't feel like an abyss. It doesn't feel hopeless. It's not a problem that I can solve, but it's a reality I can acknowledge, a paradigm through which I can understand my actions. And what Peterson does not say is what the gospel promises. When we can finally turn and acknowledge, as she says, the reality of our situation, that we will never fill that void of feeling like it's never enough. We will never fill it no matter how hard we work, no matter how much we optimize our lives, because the world does not provide a solution to this problem. Then it is out of the death of all of our hopes and dreams, by focusing solely on the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ, by which the world has been crucified to us and we to the world. Out of the ashes, the burned out husks, the dead bones of our burnout, that God can then enter into our lives and resurrect us into new life. Amen.